Hello and good evening, everyone. What a wonderful turnout. I'm so glad that Nashville is as excited about Samurai as I am. My name is Jenny Sankson, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Interpretation here at the Frisch Center. Thank you so much for joining us for the opening lecture of Samurai, the Way of the Warrior, an exhibition featuring works from the collection of the Museo Stiberti in Florence, Italy. The exhibition is on display in the Ingram Gallery, and I hope today's lecture will entice you to peruse the galleries and to learn more about a fascinating material culture. We'd like to thank you in advance for silencing your cell phones, and I'm sure your fellow audience members will thank you as well. Today, we are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Thomas Conlan introduce us to the themes and artwork of this exhibition. Dr. Conlan is a professor of East Asian Studies and History at Princeton University and has focused his research on the weapons, culture, and history of Japan from the 10th through the 16th centuries. Dr. Conlan attended graduate school at Stanford University and Kyoto University, where he received a master's degree and PhD in history. He is a recent recipient of the Japan Foundation Japanese Study Fellowship and a Fulbright Senior Scholar. If you're still hungry for more information after this lecture, I highly recommend reading some of his publications, including State of War, The Violent Order of 14th-Century Japan, and Weapons and Fighting Techniques of the Samurai Warrior. As always, we could not present these wonderful exhibitions without generous support. Our platinum sponsor for this exhibition is the HCA Foundation on behalf of HCA and TriStar Health. Our supporting sponsor is the Nissan Foundation. And we also thank the members of our Friends of Asian Art who have supported this exhibition and the Japan Foundation New York for their support of this lecture. We also recognize the Metropolitan Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts for their generous operating support. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Conlan to the stage.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Ginny and Katie and everyone at the Frisch for all their hospitality, and I'm really delighted to be here. This is my first time in Nashville, and I really find this to be a wonderful town. And so what I wanted to do is to talk to you today about the fascinating world. Oops, we have a problem here. I just shut this thing off. Of the fascinating world of Japanese arms and armor. And the beauty of the armor should be evident, but I really want to focus more on its functionality. And for today, I'm going to be referring, there's a few terms that I might use in Japanese, and I think most of you should have a handout, I hope. So there won't be a quiz, don't worry about that. And again, you can understand the talk without the terms, but for those of you who are really interested, you might find this somewhat interesting. And so for the first part of my talk, I will explain how Japanese armor protected warriors in combat, and then I will reveal how armor changed as new fighting techniques arose. I will also explain how common Japanese weapons were used, and also try to describe how tactics and things like fortifications changed over time. Now, no perfect suit of armor exists. The fundamental trade-off when we're looking at armor is protection versus mobility. When we think of armor, I think that often suits of armor like this come to mind. And although these suits are very effective at providing a lot of protection from blows and so on, they did not allow for ease of movement. And this unfortunate fact was perhaps typified by the drowning of Frederick Barbarossa in the Third Crusade, who was wearing armor as he tried to cross water that was thigh-deep in Anatolia. He fell down in the river, and once he was down, he could not get easily up. And so in that case, I would say is that the protection of his armor did him very little, did not help him much at all. Now, by contrast, I would say that here's a suit of 12th century Japanese armor, and it's known as great armor, or oyoroi. Now, if you notice, it has sort of like a box-like character, and there's a helmet, and you can see sort of some very distinctive rivets really at the top of the helmet like that. And this armor was very effective for warriors on horseback, but provided absolutely no protection for the legs at all. Now, some people have argued that this armor was really merely for display, but I would suggest that, in fact, it's highly functional. It provided good protection for the arms, and this chest piece here was actually reinforced with iron or steel, and so it really was meant it did a good job of, I'd say, protecting warriors from arrows, which was the most prevalent weapon in Japan. Now, most of this armor was made from pieces of leather or sometimes wood, and they're called sane. And you can see these little things right here. And they were, or sometimes they're called kosane, and they basically were covered with black lacquer and woven together. And so you could see, and this is a good example, you have lots of these little plates that are woven together with leather like this. And this leather is actually very well suited for the Japanese climate, which is the wettest of any temperate region in the world, whereas if you have something with a lot more steel and all that, it would tend to rust. And so this is one advantage. Now, the other thing we see is these are some very sort of weaves of sleeves, the sode, which is of the armor. And these various patterns would reveal a lot about the wearer. And so one thing is particular families often would prefer certain styles. And so someone who knew the weaving could identify what family someone was from. And more so than that, certain larger clans or lineages would prefer certain colors. And so there was, for example, one lineage called the Fujiwara, and they liked blue. There's another lineage called the Taira, and they preferred red, and another lineage called the Minamoto, and they preferred white. So when you actually see the different colors of the armor, you can really get a good sense of probably where the descent of this particular individual came from. There was another group called the Tachibana that they liked orange, and finally, I'd say what's kind of interesting is this man in black here he's doing something that's a little bit unusual, and I guess that I would say that the principle that his principle of using this armor was a little bit alien to the others. So it's like a joke, you see, like men in black. Okay, sorry. Okay, that's really bad. Okay. Now, what is going on? I keep getting this. So the next thing here is that often families, not only would they have their armor, but they would have particular standards or banners, if you were. And these are one for each familiar unit. You would actually have one person who would be the standard bearer who would go in battle carrying this large flag. Now, this was a brave act to do, but one that also led to sort of a large number of casualties for the person selected to do this, because they did not hold any particular weapons. But they were the center of attention, and I guess that was brave. As time passed, actually, and something you see this is that they would actually then attach the armor to sort of the back. Sorry, not the armor, the flags to the back like that, so that people could then use their arms in battle. Now, and here's another, this is from the screen you see today. There we have this on exhibit, and you can see here's a group of warriors, and again, you can see that there's the standard bearer right here. And so again, with this kind of flag, there's really nothing they could do but just sort of carry the flag like that. Now, as you can imagine, if each family has its own sort of identification, the real problem that comes in is because these families were not always united. They did not always fight together at the same time. And so you can imagine the real problems that would happen if you have sort of members of the same family decide to fight on different sides for a civil war. Well, there's sort of a couple things that they would do. This is a little sort of cloth marker that they would actually put often on the sleeves of their armor, and so often I'd say is that if you have the warriors that are about to sort of go to battle, they could do several things. If they see that their family members are there, they might add things like leaves or something to their armor so that they could show that they're different from the other family members. But the other thing they do is sometimes on a temporary basis, various warriors would just have this little sort of flag, which is very rare for this to survive, and they put it on their armor to show which side they were sort of belonging to. And what makes it even a little bit more interesting is that sometimes you'd have a battle and you'd have one force would put on one identifying marker, the other force would put on the other identifying marker, and then there'd be a force just be sort of hanging out there and just trying to figure out who's going to win before they decide to put on what marker. And everyone would just kind of leave them alone, and so that just shows you sort of the nature of battle. Then you might say, well, what's this have to do with sort of samurai loyalty? It's like, well, these figures weren't really loyal to a lord or another figure when they're fighting like this. Instead, they really were, I would say, loyal to their lands, their holdings. They wanted to protect them at any cost. And so I think in some ways you could say, if we would call this by a doctrine, I would say this would be like the Frank Sinatra doctrine, because they would like to do things their own way. Okay, anyways, sorry. I actually have an immense tolerance for puns, and they're really bad, so, just please forgive me on that. And so now what I like to do now is shift a little bit, coming back to the armor. And so what I want to do is sort of introduce you to the various types of armor. And again, I talked about this earlier. You've seen this slide before. This is that oyoroi, which is great armor. And this was a popular style of armor from the 10th through the 13th centuries. And almost no examples survive outside of Japan. Just to let you know, it's extremely rare, and this was something very suited for someone on horseback. And just to let you know, often people think that, well, it was the samurai, the warriors, that their sword was their most valuable weapon, but that wasn't the case. It was the armor itself that mattered more than anything else. We know that for this, all these these little plates or sane to be woven together required, I'd say, anywhere from 10 months to 2 years to accomplish. Basically, it would also cost, I'd say, about 8 times as much as a sword would be. So you get a sense of just how valuable these things are. So you don't see many examples of this oyoroi, the great armor, but there's another type. And this is, if you notice, this is a picture from the 12th century, and it's called haramaki, which it literally means like body wrap, and it was 1/4 the price of the great armor, and these are actually members of the imperial police. And you could tell that because they have these beards. They were ex-convicts that would then become members of the police force. I don't know the connection, but and they would tie the armor onto the sides. So you can see there's nothing in the back here, but the armor would be tied on the sides like that. And what's really confusing, and this is sort of the nightmarish aspect of explaining Japanese armor, is that so this body-wrapped haramaki armor that opens on the side. In the 17th century, scholars of Japan, as they're going back to their past, they misidentified it. So they start calling this by another name. So if you look at Wikipedia, this is called domaru armor, not haramaki armor. So I'm going to be going. So basically, the meanings shift to their exact opposite over time. It's very confusing. So I'm going to be giving you sort of the accurate historical definitions of that. And if you compare it to, say, Wikipedia, you'll see that haramaki is shown a very different type of armor. Now here's another version of this haramaki. Again, this body wrap. And so you can sort of see it opens on the side. And you might notice this is a little bit, this looks a little different than the other suit. And this is really remarkable because this was made for a woman who was known as Ohori Tsuruhime, who lived in the 16th century. And this is her armor. And so you can see it's actually tailored a little bit to the female anatomy. And I think one important thing to realize is that, I'm sorry about this. Whole thing keeps coming back. It was tailored to the female anatomy, and so again, there were actually several women could actually fight in battle. This is sort of a glorification or something of someone fighting like that. So that's one important thing. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more, but in fact, distinctions of gender mattered less than status, and that it's basically of a warrior house, men and women were more prepared to sort of fight in a lot of ways. So let me return back to my analysis of sort of this of armor. Now this haramaki armor I talked before was kind of simplified, but you could see that, and sometimes when people have the simplified armor, they still liked having the sleeves, and they try to make it look like it was a great suit of armor. And so that's why it's, again, very difficult to sort of categorize these various types of armor. One thing that you might also notice is that the construction can become simplified because having all this weave and these cords and all that, it could be problematic in, say, the battlefield because they could get dirty, broken, have lice and fleas infest them. So what we have is in other cases, this is just simply a suit of leather armor. And so we do see certain sort of simplified types of armor that arise from the 14th century onward. Now this is the next group, and this is called dolmaru, which is, if you could see, it's open in the back. Again, Wikipedia calls this by the exact opposite name, this was actually cheaper even than the haramaki armor. And it's more rounded, and that's why it's called like rounded armor. And this is, again, something that provided less protection than the other styles, but because it was cheaper, it was favored. And we see in this version again, this is also that rounded armor. We could tell because it opens in the back right here. And yet some people would still want to put on these sleeves to make it look like it's a suit of great armor. So those are like the main types, I would say of the older style armor. Now that being said, is that really most of the armor you'll see in this exhibit is sort of typical for the 16th century and beyond. And that tends to be of a slightly different style. And that is called, the term is Tosei Gusoku, which literally means like standard, or sort of modern armor. And this was woven in a very simplified style. So you have these larger plates here, and you have, there's some cords right here, but it's nothing quite like we saw before. And again, this is sort of a legacy of the fact that as warfare became general in the 16th century, the early styles of armor were just not as suitable, and so we see this type of armor. This is actually a booklet in one of the great lords' houses, and it's kind of interesting. I'll talk more about guns later, but if you see right here, this is actually a mark that says there is a bullet hole here, and so you do see that when guns, this was less effective in stopping bullets. But I'll talk about that in a little bit. But still, it wasn't. They still kept the suit of armor, so it wasn't completely worthless. So what I want to sort of show you is that some of the armor that we have on display really depicts this this style, this Tosei Gusoku style very well. And the weaving is called Sugake style, and that's where you just sort of weave these larger sort of panels together like that. And so this suit, I think, very, very, very well typifies this way of sort of making armor. And again, it's called mogamido, which is like you have 5 parts, I'd say, and that's probably what we see right here. And you still see these sleeves, which are kind of rounded, and again, they just have a purely decorative function. They look more prestigious, but they're not doing much at that time. This is another a variation that's called Okegawa-do, which is 8 pieces. And sometimes it can be horizontal where they're woven together, and sometimes it would be vertical. And so you see that's sort of another variation that we have. And we also have, there's a lot of chain mail where the gloves are, and also down here. And you can see some of the leggings and so on. And so that's I think it's interesting. Some of these harken a little bit more to the styles of the past, but again, if you just look at sort of the construction, you could tell that this is a more modern style of armor. Now this one is also, it's called, it's quite functional in that you have these little pieces of metal here that look like playing cards, which in Japanese is called karuta, and what we have is these little sort of cards of metal are all woven together like that. So again, it's very functional in a lot of ways. And so that's really, I'd say, is sort of, when you look at the armor, I'd say you really get a good sense of the variation really of the 16th century in a lot of ways. Now I hope that you get a little bit of sense of like some of the variation in armor like that and how it changed over time. So what I like to do now is explain basically is how this armor was also effective at sort of protecting the extremities and other sort of bits of the body. And in order to sort of, so you really appreciate that, I'd like to kind of shift my topic a bit more and talk about how warriors themselves actually fought. And in order to understand that, the most important thing is the horse. And warriors prized their horses and referred to themselves as practitioner of the way of the bow and arrow, but also the horse and the bow. Now, Japanese horses are very smooth gallopers, but they're also inquisitive. I think this picture shows that. Ornery and also rather small. And this picture shows that, again, it's a reconstruction of people in the armor, but you see these horses aren't really horses. Some of them are about 3 foot high at the shoulder, sometimes about 3.5 feet or 4 feet high at the shoulder. They would all very comfortably be classified as ponies, according to sort of modern conventions of them. And the idea that we have the horses are small here, it's nothing new. Here are some old slides, and you can again see these are like reconstructions, okay, so they're not terribly accurate, but you can see these horses are really not large at all. And so the other thing, though, is when we're looking at this, is that the importance of the horse was that they provided they were, again, smooth gallopers, so that you have the saddle here, which is very different from how we see often the Western saddles. Stirrups go back to around the 3rd, 4th century, so they are very, very old in a lot of ways, but the saddle itself was meant to provide just sort of like a stable platform, so that the warrior would not jolt around a little bit and then could sort of fire more accurately. And then here's another picture of, these are someone on horseback. Notice there's a woman, and she was actually much better than the man on horseback, because you have an advantage by being slightly smaller. And that, these horses, though, aren't necessarily slow, is that they could probably average around 25 miles per hour. The absolute world record for a Japanese horse was 37 miles an hour. A thoroughbred can reach up to about 44 miles an hour, so you get a sense of that. But the important thing to realize is, even though I could give these absolute sort of fastest speeds of these horses, they could only do them for a fairly short burst. And so let me just sort of show you. Here's a video I took of that. Let me try that again with the sound. Okay, let's try that again, okay. So I didn't show you, but actually shortly after I took that photograph, the horse reared up and dumped the rider off. That's hence I say they're ornery little creatures. So what's actually sort of telling about this is that if you are too tall, you are not well suited to being a warrior on horseback. And there was actually one famous family of generals in the far north, known as the Northern Fujiwara, and after they perished, they were mummified, and so we know how tall they were. They lived in the 1170s, and they were all over 6 feet tall. And this was actually, I'd say there's a very, in Darwinian terms, a selective disadvantage for being so tall, because the last of these great generals, his horse got exhausted because it couldn't carry someone so large, and then he was sort of captured and died. So anyways, now, and again, because you can imagine a horse so small could only gallop with someone really big for a short period of time. Now, let me just show you again. Here's sort of a nice picture from a scroll of sort of a warrior on horseback. And you can see that, in a full gallop like this, notice you have the long bow here, and notice that they're charging like this. And so you can say this is a fairly, it would be rather terrifying for someone, even on a small pony, to be coming at you, aiming at you with an arrow like this. This little thing, by the way, is where they had the bowstring. It's not a donut. Okay, so I just... But anyways, but often it wouldn't be one lone rider, but instead you'd have a group. And here we have 5 or 6, but again, you can imagine as having a bunch of people, and notice they're all using the long bows. And so they'd be coming at you, shooting at you, and I think most people would probably cower if they saw them coming like that. Now, what the goal of, you have a group of sort of a lot of archers together, notice you have this person, for example, is firing back behind him, but the goal often would be simply to just take, this is like a bear claw right here, and if you could just knock someone off the horse, then they would be, you could dispatch them at their leisure and so on. Like I cannot dispatch this Comcast thing. So what we have is, that's sort of what we see in a lot of the nature of the various charges. Now again, remember, to fight like this, one needs to be very good with their horse, because say it takes you a little while for the horse to get up to speed, say you have maybe 100 yards of it going at full gallop, and then it's going to be going back down to a cantering pace. So you don't want to be in a situation where your horse is so exhausted so someone's going to charge and overtake you. But if you're on foot, it's a different consideration entirely, because you can see there's a lot of people riding by on horse. What do? They have a little shield here, and some people just cover their faces and just sort of cower by the hills. And so I say that's really is that if you're, people on foot are very vulnerable to sort of an attack, because they could just be shot with arrows and killed or wounded. And so the point is that people, if they wanted to defend against these horse riders, would try to find various fortifications. And it might be a little hard to see, here's an interesting 14th century depiction, and a couple things you could see. One is this is sort of an unfortunate man here who his horse has run out of gas, figuratively, and you can see where he's being overtaken by someone who's killing him right there. The other one is you notice all these people are hiding behind the fortifications. These are bales of hay, and that's to protect them from horses and from arrows. And I guess maybe if you want to say they're making hay with the enemy, you can. I don't know. And the other thing that's notable is this is one where when a warrior would kill an enemy, he would cut off the head, and then you see the battle's not done, but he's leaving. And the main point was that for these warriors when they fought, the whole point was they needed proof of their battle service. And so when they would kill an enemy, they would take some part of this person and then just leave the battlefield and say, look what I've done. And yes, you could say it's a way of getting ahead in the world. So anyways, and so that's what we really have right there. Now, the other thing that you might be able to see is, notice this person is fighting, and he's just sort of smashing the person down on the head, with a sword. And so that's the other thing that's really, I'd say, kind of interesting. And actually, when you look at the helmets, try to look beneath them, because you can see the remains of some helmet liners. Because one important thing to realize is that in a battle situation, if you have a heavy helmet on and someone hits you in the head and you become unconscious or have a concussion, then they can kill you very easily. So it's just as good as wounding an enemy is just to knock them unconscious. And so what we see is that over time, there's better sort of helmet liners and protection of the head, so people don't really become unconscious in a lot of ways. So that's something you can also see, sort of a change over time. And the other thing, though, I'd say is, and maybe this should be clear, is that I mentioned that when these warriors are fighting, that they would really desire to have some way of proving their battle service to get some kind of compensation. And again, this is a very sort of interesting example where you have the warrior came in, here's the general, he has his armor here, and he's saying, look, here are my heads. And then we have a scribe who's writing this down. And so this is the thing which you might not realize, but there are very detailed battle reports. So when a warrior would come into camp, he would submit a report, and so you can see right here in their quiver where they had arrows, they also had a brush. And they say it's the way of the brush and the bow, they call it, and they would actually write up a document. And so they would be like, when they arrive in a camp, it's like, I have arrived in camp. And then the general would monogram it, yes, you're here. And sometimes the people, again, would then, return and say, just they had their paperwork so that they'd leave. The other thing that would happen is that sometimes you see this very rigorous inspection. And so if you have wounds and all that, because these warriors demanded compensation for their actions, you'd actually see cases where they would show off the wounds, and then certain generals or their administrators would inspect them. And the most sort of chilling one was once you had a case where a warrior, they said, one of my retainers, my follower, was shot through the jaw, lodged in the chest, and the administrator wrote, shallow. And I guess it was shallow in the chest, but anyways, the group that did that became very unpopular, and then no one fought for them anyways, and they were destroyed. So it's funny how that works. So anyways, now when I'm talking about sort of warfare itself, I'd say that again, and this is the important thing, is it's sort of different from how we imagine it to be, is that on occasion certain shock weapons would be used, but basically the bow it was the dominant weapon. And when we can do statistical analysis of some wounds, we get a sense between 60-80% of all wounds for much of this time are caused by arrows. And so that's something, and we actually have, there's the Japanese bow, and we have some nice some arrows here that they were usually fletched with sort of eagle or hawk feathers and so on. And what's also really kind of interesting about those is that you don't see it right here, but at times sometimes warriors would actually write down their name on their arrows. So it'd be like, hello, you have been shot by so and so, and we know this to be actually true, because during the Mongol invasions, we have is that actually there was a the Mongol general was shot, and in the Mongol accounts they mention the name of the person who shot him, and in Japanese accounts in their genealogy they have the same name. So we know there was actually some very nice communication going on during these encounters. Now, the other thing I guess I'd say is that we tend to think the arrows are okay. Well, they're nothing like guns, right? They're not so powerful. And I would actually say that we tend to underestimate them. Now, the bows themselves were made out of wood or bamboo that was bound together by glue of deer innards generally, and you have, often a warrior would have between 10 to 20 sort of arrows, and if we look, you can see we have on display a lot of the arrows where they would have this very sort of tip which was used in battle. And here's a picture you can get a sense of just how effective they were. It's just gone right through a pail like that, and if you're not thrilled with that, look at this, okay? You can see that it could shoot through a Teflon plate. So that's I think, an important thing to keep in mind, is that the Japanese longbows were very, very powerful. Now, when we look again at some of these depictions, remember I talked about the oyuroi and how they had the sleeves and all that? This is an older image, and you can see right here, notice how the arrow is being stopped by this sode. So this kind of armor, actually on horseback, was very effective at stopping arrows, because when they fire, you'd have, I've never usually done this, but you'd have the little sode like this, so they fire, it kind of comes here and protects the side, because that was a dangerous part of the armor. As there'd often be a hole there, what have you. And so that's why it was effective on horseback. But on foot, it has no meaning. That's why I would say before, the ones on foot, they'd have these sleeves and they don't really mean anything. But the other thing is that this armor, I've really been talking about how effective it is, but it had some major shortcomings. And if you think about it, this is just sort of basic biology. If you're going to be shot with an arrow, where's the worst place one of these warriors would be shot? Does anyone have any idea? The neck, exactly. Look at that, okay? So we see right here, here's an unfortunate person who's shot in the neck. So what we see is that it generally is lethal. So some of his reports, I'd see an example, they'd say, this person was wounded, shot in the neck. And then the next day they resubmit the report and it would be, this person is now dead. So it's a real problem. And you see there's a real shift in how this armor was designed then to protect the face. Now, here's the oldest example. And this is the thing called Hatsumuri. So you see it protect the cheeks and the forehead. Not a great idea. It's terrible at protecting the lower face. And so this style, if you see this, this is pre-14th century. I would say this style in art or what have you. In the 14th century, there's a thing called a hoate, and this was designed to protect the neck. And then we also see some other versions where the whole bottom of the face, the chin, and all that is protected as well. And so you see there are real improvements in the armor over time to protect the most vulnerable areas of someone. So that's what's also, I think, very important to realize, is that this armor really was designed to really sort of protect people, and it was modified over time. If you look at most of the examples, you'll see they have a lot of facial protection, and this is something it's very common from the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries beyond. Some of these things were very, this is an example I saw in Japan where you have it's like all iron, a full face mask, and then later on you get sort of stylized where it shows like a face, and so you can see a lot of those examples on display. So that's sort of another thing to think about. Now, the other weakness of this armor, and this is particularly for people on foot, is you can see is that there's no protection for the legs whatsoever, and so that's another thing to sort of keep in mind. And then as time passes, you start seeing some changes. And so I want to talk more about just sort of how to provide better protection for legs. So this is called a suneate, which would just protect the shin. There's shin guards right here. And so we can see again, here we have, it's protecting the leg like that. And then when we get to the 14th century, there's a lot of interesting things to sort of talk about in this. Notice the tiger skin scabbard and other things, but you see this is a lot of chainmail, and you can see how the legging not only protects the shin guards, but it goes up to protect the knee as well. And so again, there's a lot of movement to sort of really protect the legs, and by the time we get to the late 15th, early 16th century, you'll see that now it's almost all sort of steel armor that's protecting the back and the front. And there's a lot of other things I would say that you can this. I'd be happy to talk more about this portrait because it's a very good representation of a lot of armor. But you do also see right here, this thing is called a nodowa, so this is protecting the neck. So you have the neck protection, the better leg protection, and you still have these sleeves, which are it's sort of anachronistic, but we can see just how much things are changing, and it's still protecting people a lot. Now, and the other thing, maybe I'll sort of talk a little bit about is the nature of the swords. But I think I have another slide, so I'll come back to that a little bit. But when we talk about the swords, this is one thing that's interesting is that how the swords are sort of displayed varies over time. But I guess when I'm looking at swords or we're seeing them, is I don't see them as a battle weapon as more one for personal protection. And this is sort of a perfect example of this. I mean, here you have a guard who's with his bows and arrows, right, and he's asleep, and you have someone who's stealing all their rice. But then this is a person sleeping here, and you see he has the sword right by the bed. This is to protect against criminals. And again, these are all their documents and reports, and notice how they're right there, and they're sort of their most treasured possession in a lot of ways. And so I see that it's really sort of it's a weapon to be used as sort of a last resort in a lot of ways. Now, here's a little dagger again, and this is where, again, this person was charging too slowly, and this person came around and stabbing him. So you do see sometimes, people are using swords in battle like that, but it's relatively rare, particularly for the smaller swords. But one thing that you can imagine that becomes more popular is that where we have a lot of sort of people on horseback and so on, they tend to prefer larger swords. Now, I want to look at this. Now, this is from the 14th century again, and notice that the sword is taller than this individual. And so this was actually one style that became very popular in the 14th century. It's called an odachi, which is a great sword. And the blade would be about from 5 to 7 feet in length. And so you can imagine, you did not have any sort of cohesive units at all. Instead, if you had people on foot, they'd have this big sword, and they just swing it around. Okay, no one comes near me. Now, it could break horses' legs, friends, anything that came too close would be hit like that. But these swords also, it was remarkable, is that they were not fully sharpened. The tip was sharp, but most of it was actually rather dull. And that's because when they would use them, and I think this is very interesting. You could see that we have, there are people using pikes, but there are people using a variety of different objects, but they're really to just sort of poke and stab people. And again, this also makes sense if you've got to go to hand-to-hand combat, it's not going to be like a Hollywood film where you come up to someone and try to slash them. Instead, it's just you want to get stay as far away from them and just try to poke them. And so I'd say that's really of how they're fighting. And then you can imagine if that's the option, you want to have a sword that's 7 feet long as opposed to one that's 5 feet long, and so on. But we see that once warfare ends, people prefer shorter swords, and so they break them off and put on new fittings. And so basically very few of these very long swords survive. And here's sort of another example of just, people going around with these aren't people, this is sort of a depiction of animals, birds fighting cats. It's a fantastic thing. You can imagine it's a little catty here, but still, you can see that you have some of these nice old weapons like that. Now, and that's where just sort of, when we're looking at those, I think we have a number of really nice swords on display here, and so really should take a look at them. The key thing to realize, too, is often you see that there are mountings for the sword that can be changed a lot, and so the basic sword itself is something like this. And notice you can see this little hole, 1, 2, 3, 4 holes here. And this is designed, every time they'd shorten it, they break the hole. So we know this thing has been shortened at least by this amount. Okay, and so that's one thing that we could see. Now, a lot of people ask, well, why is the sword curved? And there's all kinds of theories about why they're curved and so on. And I'd say that, they are sharp, and they are where you have the steel is sort of folded over many times. So they're wonderful things. The forging of them is quite miraculous. Sorry, there's a little bad photo here. But you can see, actually, this is sort of the example of, this is one of the swords right here, and you can see because of the difference in the width of the metal, once it's tempered like this, you can put it in the water, you can see how the thing just naturally bends. And so that really shows you that the bending of the sword is more just sort of a function of how it was made than anything else. So then we have And then I'd say what's also kind of nice in a lot of ways is you could look at the fittings, and we have, there's some wonderful various insects and all this. This is a really nice one. And then also you could see here we have, looks like Mount Fuji and some wave patterns. And so I think that's also something that's really quite remarkable. And so I hope you can temper your enthusiasm with the skill of the production of those things. Okay. Okay, getting hostile, I see. And then again, also, you can have a variety of elements like this dragon be carved into the blade. And so as you can see, they were very much thought to be objects of beauty. And I would say, again, that all the care that's gone into these also suggests this is not something you use lightly in battle, because if you smash someone on the helmet, they might go unconscious, but your sword would often get broken. And then when we look at the swords too, these are the two types which you might have heard is called a katana and a wakizashi. One is simply longer than the other. And they have this very distinctive sort of style. This sort of fits what we think of a samurai sword, but this way of having the swords doesn't come into really use until the 15th century. So I want to come back to this portrait right here, and look right here. Notice this is, I think, you have, this is the warrior I talked about before. Notice he has several swords. One is, there's no scabbard, it's up like this. And notice how this one, you have the tiger skin right here, but also you have the sword. And it's in a style called a tachi style, because what T-A-C-H-I, and what that is that the blade would be down below. So the person would sort of, remove the sword like that. But this was the standard way of having one of these swords. And then when we look at the 15th century, coming back to this, I really want to point out several things. This one right here is still in the tachi style. So we have is the cutting edge is down here, but this one looks more like the modern sort of swords, and the cutting blade is above. And this would be something where if you just draw it quickly, it's actually, you have an advantage if you have the blade above. And so all the examples we really have of like katana are more of this style. And so you say, why does this shift? I don't have a good explanation. My guess is this was a weapon of protection. And so as there be assassinations or something in the 15th century, I'd say is if you shift it, so instead of having the sword where you have to pull it out like this and have it there, we just pull it out very quickly, it would give you a few seconds advantage over someone. So I think that's the reason why we see it. It's more like for sudden conflicts or something like that is why we'd see some of this shift in sort of the sword mountings, and why we have it so the blade is up versus down. But we don't have a good explanation for that. But also you can see is that there's such great variation in these things. The workmanship is just wonderful for the fitting. So there's the sword themselves, but also, and these are a number of the wakizashi, which are slightly shorter swords. And so please, really look very carefully at these, because they're really quite nice. And then these are called tanto, which are really the sort of daggers. And the only way these different terms, it's just the length of the sword. So if it's like a foot or 12 inches or smaller, it'd be a dagger. A wakizashi would be about to a foot and a half, and then longer than that's a katana. So that's really, I'd say, is how you can identify some of the other swords. And I didn't really show you too much, but I'll go back, because sorry. This thing right here, this long thing, is called a nagamaki. This was actually one long sword. This is not a pipe. So what they would do sometimes is they would just wrap half the sword and just keep the sharp end out. So again, and that variation you never see today, but that's sort of another style. Sorry as I went through those things. Now the other thing we have is here, these are the tsuba, these are the sword guards. And I would say that they're quite remarkable. Craftsmen sometimes write their names, and there's a whole variety of motifs. This tells you it's someone in Kyoto. This is someone in Western Japan. And again, you really see a flowering of designs. For example, this one dates from the 19th century, and I think it's someone of, the skill of depicting the fish is really remarkable. It's like something, the equivalent of an Audubon. Or this one too, where we have this snake here, and you can see this, the beauty of these things. So really, I hope you can enjoy them. Now again, I want to come back to the helmets, which I've been talking about various types of armor, and so now let me look at sort of the helmet itself. And the oldest style is one where you have iron plates that are sort of bound together by rivets. And this is really, we have this one helmet that's very sort of emblematic of that style. They say it's from the 16th century. I'm wondering whether this is actually a 15th century helmet, the base of it. That's just kind of my feeling of that. Because if we look at them, one thing is that the older helmets have a very different shape, but this thing here is called akodonari, which is like melon-shaped. And it was the idea that it would prevent people from getting concussion if it got hit on the top of the helmet. And this is another 15th century helmet right here. And you can sort of see, you don't have the rivets, because sort of it was basically, I'd say that instead of rivets, you just see, with improvements in technology, that these plates would just be welded together like that. And so again, if we come back to this portrait, we could see, notice how this looks very similar to what I just showed you. So this is very typical of 15th, early 16th century sort of helmets. And there's this other thing right here, it's called fortifications, which is meant to protect the side of the face, because you don't want to get shot from the side, so these little things out there would nominally protect someone. And then what we see is later suits of armor, you have the degree of craftsmanship skill was such that you'd have the more of these plates, the better the craftsman. And so the more prestigious the helmet. And you can see these fukikai are just now very residual, okay, because they've lost that original function. And so this is something that's still more in the old style, but it's a newer helmet, I would say, in a lot of ways. Then we also have another type, which is the other helmets, and I think we have a really wonderful collection. They're known as sort of different helmets, strange helmets. And they all come in really around the 16th century. And the reason for that is actually there's a real increase in the skill of metallurgy. And certain craftsmen are able to basically construct the helmet of anywhere between 1 to 3 pieces of steel. And once they do that, it becomes so much stronger that it can support a lot of various decorations and so on. And you see that, for example, this is sort of a wave decoration, actually, and so you have the original steel helmet, but this was actually, it was lacquered paper is something to make that. But other ones are all metal, and so this is a nice conch shell here, and this is called a shachihoko, which is thought to be a mythological creature that if it got hit by lightning or something would just vomit forth all kinds of water. They put this at the top of castles, but I don't know why someone put it on top of their helmet, but it's still, they must have liked them, and so on. And then I think this dragon is really remarkable because it just shows you it's all one piece of steel, or maybe it's several pieces of steel, but you get a sense of just the incredible craftsmanship and how skillful these people are. And again, it's just fun it provides a lot of protection, but this is something that could not have been done before the 16th century, where they could work with large pieces of steel like this. And then I think the best example of two really good examples of some of these strange helmets. Here you have someone, and this thing here is actually, you might wonder, what is that depicting? It's a brush. So you could say, well, this sort of epitomizes the idea that the warriors are practitioners of martial and civil arts. And I don't know, the other possibility to say, did this person want to sort of imagine that he had a brush with death? I don't know. So, it's hard to say. But it was, again, made out of paper mache. But I don't think you'd want to say that this person was like a paper tiger or anything like that at all, because that's something else. Okay. Oh boy, we're getting hostile. And then the other one is, this is another very creative helmet that we have here with the horns and some demons, and that's right at the beginning of the exhibit, which is really quite nice. And here's another, I think, remarkable one that's known as the Crow Tengu. It's actually Izuna Gongen, and it's a deity of again, war that you could see. Here's some depictions of this deity and so on, and you can see that people would then put that on their helmets. And so it does look kind of like a crow-like figure, so you could argue that, maybe this connection was something that people wanted to crow about. I don't know. So anyways, see, the more groans I get, the more I keep doing the puns. So, but anyways. So that we have that right there. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is just talk a little bit about guns. I've alluded to them before, and now I've kind of finished up talking about just a general sense of the armor and how people fought to a certain degree and how we can understand it from the armor. What's really quite interesting is that the common narrative is that guns arrived in Japan with the Portuguese. We now know that's not the case. They actually, this very primitive three-barrel construction, this kind of gun, arrived in Okinawa in the 1460s, if not before. And they found the remains of lots of bullets at a castle that was abandoned in 1460. And recently they found at that same castle some Byzantine coins. And so this suggests, I'd say, that, that basically through probably the Indian Ocean and all that, we're seeing a movement of a lot of goods. These early guns were not particularly effective, but they still would, make a lot of noise and sort of, cause people to sort of be surprised. And then these are the later, the Portuguese guns, that come in a little bit later. And again, they would be, you'd have this rope which you use to fire them, which you could tell that, if you had a bunch of gunners, it would not be good to have a battle on a rainy day. And I would say that one thing that's quite remarkable is that we tend to assume that when guns arrived in Japan, it completely transformed warfare. And actually, I would say that's not the case. I haven't really gone into this per se. But when you're analyzing warfare, I think one important thing is think about what is the function of weapons. And the fact that there's a famous book saying that guns supplanted the swords and this. And it's like actually what the weapon that guns would supplant would be the bow and arrow. And it actually took a long time for people to sort of become aware of the fact that the guns were actually a better weapon. So this I find is very interesting because, again, it looks like they're shooting at crows here, but we have an archer and a marksman, and they're testing this out to see which one works better. And so remember, again, that the Japanese bows can pierce Teflon. And it's probably, I'd say that the only difference is the guns, the killing length, is probably maybe 60 meters versus 30 meters, comparing guns to bows and arrows. And because of that, there's just a gradual sense that this is actually a superior weapon on the battlefield. But it really takes around, I would say, particularly when even the Portuguese comes in the 1540s, it's not really until 1600 that 80% of the projectile wounds are caused by guns, not bows and arrows. And here's like a picture where you can see people with guns and bows and arrows fighting together. And I've seen some of these wound charts where you have a person who was shot by both bullets and arrows at the same encounter. And you can say, yes, that person had a bad day. And what's also remarkable is, remember I showed you that one suit of armor that had the remains of a bullet hole. And here you could see with some of the steel armor, these are also remains of bullet holes that, it was effective at stopping that. So that's something. So I would say, yes, gradually guns become a dominant weapon, but they don't supplant, I'd say that it's not, in terms of like shock weapons, the most important weapon there is actually a weapon I haven't talked about because there's nothing really artistic about it, and that is the pike, or the spear, as it were. And what we see is that really in Japan, that you have this movement from where you have sort of the horse riders would dominate the battlefields really until the mid-15th century. And because, a force of horsemen with their bows and arrows could go around and defeat just about anyone, until you have a moment where certain regional figures were able to get armies that would be long, sort of standing armies. They could train together, and they started using pikes. And you've all seen the movie Braveheart, right? Well, that sort of happens in Japan in the 15th century, where you have the creation of large sort of pike-wielding armies, and then they can defeat the cavalry. And the pike remains the dominant weapon in Japan for the 15th to 16th century. And some of these pikes would have a range, sometimes they could be like, 19 to 24 feet long. And so you get a sense, again, of that. That's sort of the dominant shock weapon in a lot of ways. Now, the final thing, though, and I guess I'd say that, so I've kind of talked about how the military changes in tactics have no correlation to the introduction of guns. And the guns just gradually lead to some changes. But that doesn't mean that a lot of sort of European weapons didn't have an impact. And probably the most important thing is not the gun, but the cannon. And that was something that, this one is actually, they found it off it's known as a Franki, which in Japanese comes from, it's probably from the word Frankish. These were prized weapons. Some were known as country destroyers. And you had some of these generals would basically say, well, if you give me a cannon, I'll convert to Christianity, to the Portuguese and other things. And we know that they could fire sometimes like a projectile around 2 inches in diameter that weighed about 3 pounds, so they'd be fairly small projectiles. But then you do see the ones below. These are called Taiho, which is another kind of cannon. And these things could actually sometimes fire shells that weighed up to around 40 pounds. And sometimes they could fire them for about I'd say, half a mile or so. So you see this movement toward creating lots of sort of artillery. And that's something that is quite prized. And as a result of that, you see a real transformation in Japanese sort of fortifications. Whereas before they preferred earthen walls and all that, and then what we start seeing again, sort of this is very late 16th century, is the creation of these sort of giant stone-walled castles. And so this is sort of, if you go to Osaka, this is Osaka Castle, and you can see this is one giant rock. Which is impressive, but actually, if you look at the side, it's only about this thick. So, but still, and I would say that here's sort of Osaka Castle, and again, this is a castle that was built in the late 16th century, and it was effective as long as they could keep the cannons away. But what happened is one encounter in 1615, the one besieging army started shooting their cannons, and then they couldn't reach it. And they said, let's have a truce. And so the people of the castle says, okay, that's great. Then they filled in the third moat. They left, and they came back, got their cannons closer, and shot up the castle and won. So I'd say that the cannons actually had a far greater impact than any other weapon. And you can call that a pun or not. So anyways, what I'd like to do is really I'd sort of like to sort of, leave some time for questions. So what I want to do is conclude here, and maybe I'll just show you this. This is sort of a depiction. It's not a great image of like an earlier castle, and you can see how you have these very simple wooden fortifications, but there are no stone walls, no real structures at all. So you can sort of see then this huge transformation in sort of fortification technology, and I think that's one of the really the greatest legacies of these cannons, which unfortunately we don't have any examples right here. But I would like to sort of conclude my talk right now, and I hope that we had a fortifying discussion of Japanese arms and armor. And it should be clear, my title is a little bit misleading because, we talk about the samurai as a military order that was defined by the sort of wearing of two swords. And sort of the samurai order, I'd say, really is something that really only came into existence once peace arose. And I haven't talked about that as much, but what we had is once the civil wars of Japan ended in the early 17th century, all the warriors were given a choice. They could either keep their lands and give up their status, and so that means they maintain the lands, but then be called a peasant, or they could have some swords, keep the status, and be called a samurai. And at the same time, by doing that, they would have to live by the castle and give up their lands and give up their autonomy. So that really from the 17th century onward, we have a Japan at peace, and that's where we have a warrior order that's devoted to, I'd say, some obsolete weapons like the swords or bows and arrows. They work on their martial arts, and they start to sort of glorify and think about their past once they stop fighting. And they actually do, there's a lot of great scholarship that they would do about their past, but they would make some mistakes like mischaracterize certain types of armor, which leads to confusion for centuries. But by misremembering the past, I think that's sort of another legacy of the samurai, or perhaps that's their greatest creation, at least in terms of their surviving bits of arms and armor, because as long as sort of what they have created, this idealization, is something which remains with us to this day. So again, thank you very much for your time. Any questions or? Yes, in the back.
You showed many pictures of warriors covered fully with gear, protective gear, sitting on a horse without any protective gear. What's the point?
So a lot of warriors sitting on horses without protective gear, you said? Horses. Oh, the horses. Yeah, well, because the horses are not that large, and because of the weight of the rider, to have a lot of the protective gear would just slow down the horse. And I think that was such a disadvantage that they would rarely use it. Sometimes they would put on some chain link, but I'd say the more common thing would be, you see this in some accounts where they would try not to endanger the horses. And so there's one case where, like, they're fighting and one guy fell off his horse and everyone's waiting. It's like, should we rush to protect him? It's like, well, if we do, our horses are going to die. And they just kind of wait there. It's like, oh, sorry, and so on. So that's what they would tend to do. The horses sometimes would suffer arrow wounds. You see what I mean? But in the earlier period, the people and the horses, they had a certain tolerance for arrow wounds. Actually, it was quite surprising. If they got shot in the hand, for example, you'd see that they were shot, and then they'd show up in battle the next day. So they seemed that was not thought to be quite so problematic. And if they would not use the horses if you're going to have a direct confrontation with someone on foot. You see what I mean? They just wouldn't do that. And so I guess that's why you wouldn't have the armor. You don't see this sort of charge through infantry. That's not a tactic they would usually do. I hope that answers it, your question.
Yeah, I'd like to find out if the armor was reclaimed by the family, and would another warrior use the armor from a dead peer?
Oh, that's a good. Well, yes, they would. I mean, so what you'd see is that the armor was so valuable. It was like the center of all inheritance disputes would be armor. And yes, if someone was killed, the first thing they do is they'd strip off the armor. And sometimes you can actually, some of the suits we have here, they would often have familial marking devices. And so what happened, you just take that off and put on another device like that. And so that was thought to be a great sort of spoil of war in a lot of cases. So they never find armor like the archaeologists, because it would always be picked up. You don't find these artifacts because they're so valued that people would always sort of take them with them.
Tom, are you familiar with any comparison between the protection offered by Kevlar as compared to the lacquered leather?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I would think that the Kevlar would be superior, I mean, but in a lot of ways, I think it's sort of interesting just thinking in terms of, I mean, the lacquer, I don't know, how much protection do you get? It's better than nothing. Do you see what I mean? But it's not. I mean, where this armor was really most effective is it would be steel enforced at the chest level, right? And again, you might just say, okay, I want more mobility and just a little bit of the paper lacquer. You know what I mean? So it's like if it's a very distant arrow, it would help. And again, sometimes they could. I said that the impact, like when they're shooting an arrow, it would be like 30 yards where it could pierce armor. But they could shoot these things for hundreds of yards. You see what I mean? And they were called distant arrows. And so it would go, and it just would not have that much impact. And so that would be the other side of it. So it would be useful, I'd say, for those things. Yeah. Yes.
I was startled to hear you mention the blurring of gender roles, and because I think of Japan as being pretty traditional in terms of gender roles. What was the role of women as warriors, and how did that change over time in terms of?
No, it's a great question. I mean, it's I would say this, that in the earlier societies, status mattered more than gender, and that these warrior households, I mean, to be really good on horseback like this, you really needed to start riding when you're 5, very young. And so what we see is that there was, few enough people, and also the fact that once you're on horseback, men versus women, there was not that great a difference. I would say if you're effective at firing a bow, then it doesn't really matter. So you never get comments about it. You never have things saying, oh, women shouldn't fight or whatever. They just somebody mentioned, oh, a force went by, is mostly women. You'd see every so often you find comments like that. And so, women could, I talked about the importance of these warriors. They had a particular lands which were cherished above all else. Remember I said they were like loyal to their lands. And women could inherit, and men, it didn't matter. They could also basically serve on guard duty and everything. So if you look at the Japanese law codes of like the 1230s, women had complete rights to own land, inherit land, and do what they want. And that was actually the traditional society in a lot of ways, I'd say. And it changes later when you see even more emphasis on a house. I mean, it's when the most valuable thing isn't land, which is partible, but a particular office, like being a great general. And once you only have the essence of your familial holdings can't be divided, then you start seeing an emphasis on selecting one heir. And once that happens, there's a tendency to emphasize men and so on. And so I'd say that's really a process you see 16th century where things shift. And then that becomes thought of as being traditional, and the idea that women would never fight in the battlefield. But the evidence is that wasn't the case at all.
What was the nature or identity of the entities that fought each other?
The nature?
What were they? Small provinces or princes or?
It's a good question. I mean, a lot of the civil wars were bound around sort of one fundamental question, and that is sort of what are the limits of state power? And that what happened is that during this period I'm talking about, why it came about, it's a good question, I could talk for about an hour on this, is you had often, I'd say, this idea that the emperor, the leader of Japan, was sort of a universal monarch that could distribute lands to whoever they saw fit. And there happened to be a civil war that was really against central authority, and these warriors won. And what happens, they was given a right called the Jito right. And this right it's the idea that this could never be taken away from this person. If you had it, you could give it to your sons, your daughters, to your dogs. It didn't matter. You had absolute freedom, and the state could not interfere with that. And I would say that then becomes the dominant dynamic, because for a long time, any emperor or autocratic figure wants to break down this autonomous power, and these people want to defend it. So you actually have several civil wars started by emperors, and they're trying to then basically crush these rights, and the warriors will resist. And the irony is that we have in the 14th century, it's like 60 years of civil war, and the warriors, the land is not good at paying for an ongoing conflict. And so as a result, they lose the ability to sort of act autonomously, and they become subsumed into these larger organizations, because you start seeing the rise of these great generals who are given half of all the lands of a province. And so they become these incipient magnates, which then gradually sort of impose a much sort of stronger sense of sort of centralized authority on these figures over the course of centuries. Does that make sense? Or, it's kind of that's why I say it's like the larger struggle, as where's they're fighting themselves? Well, most of Japan's mountainous. And so the battles would tend to be, if you're on horseback, you tend to be on larger plains. But you'd prefer that. Or if you go to the cities, they would burn down the cities or burn down various areas because you want room for the horses to roam. Whereas if you have infantry formations, they want to get the horses in there where there's no mobility. You see what I mean? And so that's always the conflict. That all changes in the 15th century when, again, we start seeing the rise of these sort of standing armies, and they actually defeat the cavalry on the open battlefield, and then that leads to a very different kind of warfare where we have trenches and people with pikes and all that. So it really does change over time. Yes?
In all of the illustrations, it shows the arrows facing down in the quiver. And I was surprised to see in the display case the placard saying that the arrows were pointed down in the quiver.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile the two?
So you said that they're all pointed down in the quiver, right?
The placard in the display case
Mm-hmm.
says that the arrows were pointed down. The fletch portion was at the bottom, meaning that the arrowhead was pointed up, whereas, like in this illustration, the arrows are pointed down.
Oh, there might be some variation, but I generally see it that generally they would have the tips down, I would say, just because you don't want to damage the feathers. But there might be differences.
I think we're going to take one more question.
I was interested in the size of the armies and these conflicts. In the pictures, they're just depicting a few people, but that could be representative of larger numbers. What kind of numbers are you looking at in a battle?
That's a great question as well. It varies over time. So what we have is in the 12th century, they would talk about a force of when it's cavalry, it's a lot smaller. So they talk about a force of 50, which actually would still be quite effective. In the 14th century, the armies are getting, I know they're in the hundreds. In the 15th century, they're in the thousands. And what's really remarkable is over the course of the 16th century, they go from being a sort of from a few thousand to over 100,000. So by the end of the 16th century, and it's a very complex phenomenon where they basically made rice or food the currency, so you wouldn't have inflation, and so you could have these armies. But we know from one province one of these lords could mobilize 30,000. And so I'd say that probably in the 1580s, 1590s, right at the end of this period, that Japan had by far the largest. I think maybe the Ming had larger armies, but around the largest armies in the world. And so that's why they were able to sort of repel the Portuguese and all that, because they had such formidable military force. So that's also, I didn't really talk about it, but the rise of these great lords. I've kind of talked the view of breaking down the autonomy of these figures, but the other side of it is these great lords became these incredible organizational figures who were able to extract revenue and make these armies larger and larger and larger. And so that's another process which is happening. And they also were responsible for arming everyone in their armies. And so that's where you get sort of much more standardization in the armor, and that's why I made the jokes about the lacquered paper armor. But that's a way to also deal with that, because the expenses are just incredible. Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful place for us to close. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Conlan, for such a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.